As you can tell, I was kicked out of my classroom, so welcome to my home. And this week, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, GDP. Last time we talked about the ways that we can measure an economy. This is one of the best ways to see how well your economy is doing. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. GDP answers the question, how big is your economy? Gross domestic product is our total value of all the goods and services that your economy makes within that country's borders. So if we look at, for example, Indonesia, you're going to see its GDP as of 2018 was just over $1 trillion. So if we add up all the stuff that they made and all the services that they provided, it would equal just over $1 trillion. So that's what is included in GDP. It's the stuff that we make. So what isn't included? Things that are not included in GDP would be things like non-market goods and services, like the chores that you do for your parents, or childcare, or any like vegetables that you grow at your house in a plant. It's tough to place a monetary value on those goods and services because how do you know how much a chore is really worth? Another thing that isn't included is intermediate products, so things that are used to make other products. For example, steel used to make cars, we really only count the final product, the car, for GDP. We don't count the steel. Or corn that feeds cattle, we would only count the final steaks that we sell in a grocery store as part of our GDP, or coal that's used to burn electricity. So we only count the final good because we don't want to count things twice. Another thing not included is illegal drugs and prostitution and other illegal things. You can't include those because those aren't being sold legally within your country. In case you're wondering, the underground economy of the United States, we can estimate makes up about 30% of Mexico's GDP, whereas it makes up about 8% of the United States. So about $1.1 trillion in the United States every year is on these underground illegal goods. We also don't count things that have already been sold. For example, if you go buy a used car, that's not counted in GDP. We only count it once when it's sold the first time. We call those secondhand goods. And another thing that's not counted is our negative bads. For example, if we are producing a heck of a lot of, for example, cars, and it takes up an incredible amount of resources, we don't count all the minerals that we have to mine. So we don't look at the environmental pollution, we don't look at the loss of human life, we don't look at these negative value of the quote-unquote bads here as counted as GDP. So how do we calculate GDP? I know you've missed your calculators. Here's how we do it. You take C plus I plus G plus NX, which I know you probably don't know what those mean right now, which is fine. We're about to go into a little bit more detail, but this is the equation that you're going to need on this slide. So we say GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So let's start with each one of those different components. What is C? C is the largest part of GDP. It's consumption. So it's the actual money that you and I go and spend on actual goods and services. So you go to the store, you buy things, it's counted in consumption. So you buy things. You buy a new car, you go play around with golf, you pick up groceries, it's all counted in consumption. It's the most common part of GDP. It's about 70%. So it's almost more than half and almost 3/4 of it. The I part, I is investments. So it's your company investing in its own company. It's not you saying, I'm going to go invest in the stock market. That's where sometimes students can get confused. It's a company reinvesting in itself. In this case, a company could invest in itself by buying machinery, new equipment, hiring new people, construction, new office buildings. That would be investment. A company that's invests in itself. One great example of that is Amazon. Amazon really doesn't turn a profit every year. They just keep putting their money back into itself and continue to expand their products, make their delivery times faster, more warehouses, more software engineers to create new things. That's what Amazon does. They are always reinvesting in themselves, and we count that towards GDP as well. The G stands for government. It's government purchases. That excludes us giving money to other governments or the government giving us money, which, hey, they might be doing that soon because of the COVID-19 epidemic. But government purchases. So for example, if our government decides that they're going to build a new DMV office, that's included in government purchases. Or if our government decides to give the salaries that they have to give to all their government workers, that's included in the government as well. Or building new roads or bridges or airports, whatever that might be, that's all included in government expenditures. And finally, NX stands for net exports. X, which is exports minus imports. Exports, the stuff that you make in your country and sell to other countries. That's stuff you like, because it means it's adding jobs and money to your economy. Imports are the things that we don't like. It's stuff that's made overseas that we consume in the United States. So that's how you calculate GDP. Now let's take a look at this example. Let's say you have an economy that has rising housing prices and is selling more cars this year than last year. Nominal GDP would increase because of both the rising housing prices and more car sales. But we're going to talk about real GDP. Real GDP is the better one. Real GDP only is going to show an increase in car sales because we're selling more cars. We're actually not going to count rising housing prices. And the reason why we don't do that is because of inflation. Just because the housing prices are going up doesn't mean that you're making more houses. But if you're selling more cars, it does mean that your GDP is going up because GDP is seeing how much stuff you make in your economy. So the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP is that real GDP accounts for inflation. And that's why economists think real GDP is a better indicator of how well your economy is doing than nominal GDP, which just takes a look at all the prices. So let's see how we would calculate this out. Let's take a very basic economy that only produces one good. We have different years and the output of that good that they make in the price per unit. Nominal GDP is super easy to calculate here. You just take your output times your price. So for year one, it's 5 times 10, which is $50. In year 2, it's 7 times 20, which is 140. In year 3, it's 8 times 25, 200. In year 4, 10 times 30 is 300. In year 11, year 5, it's 11 times 35, which is 385. Easy to calculate nominal GDP, just multiply the output times your price. But real GDP accounts for inflation. So how do we do that? Well, in year 1, it's the exact same thing. We just multiply it across. The reason why is for every year after year 1, we're going to use year 1 as a base year. Meaning in year 2, what we do is we take our output and we times it by year 1's price. So in year 2, we take 7 and we multiply it times 10 to get a real GDP of $70, not 140. Because the 140 shows the inflation. It's just the price went up. But really all we did was produce 2 more products. We didn't produce $90 more product. We actually only produced about $20 in new product if we use year 1 as a base year. So in year 3, I would times 8 times 10, using year 1 as my base year to get $80. In year 4, I'd use 10 times 10 to get $100. And in year 11, I do year 5, I'd use $11 times 10 in my base year price to get 110. So again, real GDP, you use year 1 as your base year and multiply the output times the year 1 price. And nominal GDP, you use that year's price. So you just multiply across output times price. In case that didn't get through, here's one other example. We can take output times price again and get nominal GDP for all the columns. So in year 1, we do 100 times 10. We get $1,000 in nominal GDP. In year 2, we get 120 times 20 to give us 2,400. In year 3, it's 160 times 20 to get 3,200. In year 4, it's 220 times 30 to get us 6,600. In year 5, it's 200 times 40 to give us a real nominal GDP of 8,000. But when we do real GDP, we would take year 1 as our base year. So in year 1, it's the same thing because we're using the same price, so it's still $1,000. But in year 2, we're going to take the 120 times the price of $10 in year 1 to get a real GDP of $1,200. And in year 3, it'll be 1,600 as we take 160 times 10. In year 4, 220 times 10 gives me 2,200. And year 5, it gives me 200 times 10 to give me 2,000. The interesting thing here about real GDP and why economists like it is you can see between year 4 and 5, real GDP actually goes down, which is good to know because look, your output's going down. If we use nominal GDP, you think your economy's doing great. But all we did was raise the price. We're actually producing less. And if you're producing less, that means people are consuming less. If people are consuming less, your business is making less money and you can't hire as many people. You might have to lay off people. So real GDP, a much better indicator of how well your economy is doing. If we want to measure GDP growth, you do this by taking year 2 minus year 1 over year 1. So you find out your GDP for whatever year 2 is. So if we were looking at 2016 to 2015, year 2 would be the later year. It would be 2016, we compare it to 2015. So this will be an important equation as well, and let's take a look at an example. Indonesia, 2016 to 2015. In 2016, Indonesia's GDP was 932 billion. In 2015, it's 860 billion. So we're going to take, this is our year 2, this is our year 1. So we'll do year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1. So 932 billion minus 860 billion divided by 860 billion. You do 932 minus 860, simplify that down, you get 72 over 860. And 72 over 860 gives you 0.0837. We make that into a percent by moving over the decimal place twice, like your 6th grade teacher taught you how to do, and you get 8.37% economic growth in Indonesia. Ideal GDP growth is about 2 to 3%. If you have higher, that's great. If you have too high, though, it can mean that your economy might be growing by so much, so fast, it can actually lead to a lot of inflation. So sometimes a super high GDP growth isn't so great. Another measure is GDP per capita. That's when you take your GDP divided by your population. That gives you your GDP per capita. So again, let's take a look at Indonesia. In 2016, we said that the population is 261 million people, and we found their GDP to be 932 billion. So you take 932 billion, make sure you put enough zeros on there, divided by 261 million, a different number of zeros at the end, and you get a total GDP per capita of $3,571 per person. We like real GDP per capita because it actually gives us a great opportunity to compare a living standard between one country to the next. The more GDP per person you have, the better standard of living you have. In the United States, it's about like $60,000-ish. It's a rough estimate of how much money, on average, each American makes in income. Obviously, it's not accurate because we have some people who are making a bunch of money, like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and you got a bunch of people who aren't making a lot of money, like me. A higher real GDP per capita is usually associated, again, with a higher standard of living. Take this small country, Qatar, $60,780 per person. That's a high GDP per capita. Now, you might think China, high GDP. Yeah, they have the second highest GDP in the world, but they actually have one of the much lower GDP per capitas because they have so many people. So lower GDP per capita is often associated with a lower standard of living, and while China is actually only $8,826 per person because they have over 1 billion people in their country, and when you take their enormous GDP divided by over 1 billion people, you're not going to get as much money there. So these are a variety of different measures that we use with GDP. We calculate it to figure out how much is your total GDP worth, and we keep in mind what is actually included in it, which is just things that are made within your country and services. We don't count things. You can see the earlier part of the video to recap that. Then we can compare GDPs from one country to the next. We can look at GDP growth by measuring year 2 minus year 1 and find out by what percent is our economy growing each year. Ideally, you want to see a positive percentage every single year in your economy. We can see GDP per capita divided by the population. It gives us a good idea of standard of living. So GDP is a very helpful tool that economists use in order to see how well is our economy doing from one year to the next and from one country to the next. And so I'll have you do a little worksheet that goes along with this. If you have any questions, you can send me an email. You can take a look at the slides. You can chat with me in our Google Meet. And I'll see you next time from my humble abode. Now I have to walk over and grab the iPad, which is in quite the interesting position. I have to stack it on top of a shoe rack in order to get my tall self in.